For God's sake, don't go into the details of your condition, Paget. I don't want to hear them. Very well, Sir Eustace. But my belief is that I was deliberately poisoned. Ah. I said. You've been talking to Rayburn. He did not deny it. At any rate, Sir Eustace, he thinks so and he should be in a position to know. By the way, where is the chap? I asked. I've not set eyes on him since we came on board. He gives out that he's ill, and stays in his cabin, Sir Eustace. Paget's voice dropped again. But that's camouflage, I'm sure. So that he can watch better. Watch. Over your safety, Sir Eustace. In case an attack should be made upon you. You're such a cheerful fellow, Paget, I said. I trust that your imagination runs away with you. If I were you I should go to the dance as a death's head or an executioner. It will suit your mournful style of beauty. That shut him up for the time being. I went on deck. The Bedingfeld girl was deep in conversation with the missionary parson, Chichester. Women always flutter round parsons. A man of my figure hates stooping, but I had the courtesy to pick up a bit of paper that was fluttering round the parson's feet. I got no word of thanks for my pains. As a matter of fact, I couldn't help seeing what was written on the sheet of paper. There was just one sentence: "Don't try to play a lone hand or it will be the worse for you." That's a nice thing for a parson to have. Who is this fellow Chichester, I wonder? He looks mild as milk. But looks are deceptive. I shall ask Paget about him. Paget always knows everything. I sank gracefully into my deck chair by the side of Mrs. Blair, thereby interrupting her tête-à-tête with Race, and remarked that I didn't know what the clergy were coming to nowadays. Then I asked her to dine with me on the night of the fancy dress dance. Somehow or other Race managed to get included in the invitation. After lunch the Bedingfeld girl came and sat with us for coffee. I was right about her legs. They are the best on the ship. I shall certainly ask her to dinner as well. I would very much like to know what mischief Paget was up to in Florence. Whenever Italy is mentioned, he goes to pieces. If I did not know how intensely respectable he is I should suspect him of some disreputable amour. I wonder now. Even the most respectable men, it would cheer me up enormously if it was so. Paget with a guilty secret. Splendid. Chapter 13. It has been a curious evening. The only costume that fitted me in the barber's emporium is that of a teddy bear. I don't mind playing bears with some nice young girls on a winter's evening in England, but it's hardly an ideal costume for the equator. However, I created a good deal of merriment, and won first prize for brought on board, an absurd term for a costume hired for the evening. Still, as nobody seemed to have the least idea whether they were made or brought, it didn't matter. Mrs. Blair refused to dress up. Apparently she is at one with Paget on the matter. Colonel Race followed her example. Anne Bedingfeld had concocted a gypsy costume for herself, and looked extraordinarily well. Paget said he had a headache and didn't appear. To replace him I asked a quaint little fellow called Reeves. He's a prominent member of the South African Labour Party. Horrible little man, but I yearn to keep in with him, as he gives me information that I need. I want to understand this Rand business from both sides. Dancing is a hot affair. I danced twice with Anne Bedingfeld and she had to pretend she liked it. I danced once with Mrs. Blair, who didn't trouble to pretend, and I victimized various other damsels whose appearance struck me favorably. Then we went down to supper. I had ordered champagne. The steward suggested Clicquot 1911 as being the best they had on the boat, and I fell in with his suggestion. I seemed to have hit on the one thing that would loosen Colonel Race's tongue. Far from being taciturn, the man became actually talkative. For a while this amused me, then it occurred to me that Colonel Race, and not myself, was becoming the life and soul of the party. He chaffed me at length about keeping a diary. It will reveal all your indiscretions one of these days, peddler. My dear Race, I said, I venture to suggest that I am not quite the fool you think me. I may commit indiscretions, but I don't write them down in black and white. After my death, my executors will know my opinion of a great many people, but I doubt if they will find anything to add or detract from their opinion of me. A diary is useful for recording the idiosyncrasies of other people but not one's own. There is such a thing as unconscious self-revelation, though. In the eyes of the psychoanalyst, all things are vile, I replied sententiously. You must have had a very interesting life, Colonel Race, said Miss Bedingfeld, gazing at him with wide, starry eyes. That's how they do it, these girls. Othello charmed Desdemona by telling her stories, but, oh, didn't Desdemona charm Othello by the way she listened? Anyway, the girl set Race off all right. He began to tell lion stories. A man who has shot lions in large quantities has an unfair advantage over other men. It seemed to me that it was time I, too, told a lion story. One of a more sprightly character. By the way, I remarked, that reminds me of a rather exciting tale I heard. A friend of mine was out on a shooting trip somewhere in East Africa. One night he came out of his tent for some reason, and was startled by a low growl. He turned sharply and saw a lion crouching to spring. He had left his rifle in the tent. Quick as thought, he ducked, and the lion sprang right over his head. Annoyed at having missed him, the animal growled and prepared to spring again. Again he ducked, and again the lion sprang right over him. This happened a third time, but by now he was close to the entrance of the tent, and he darted in and seized his rifle. When he emerged, rifle in hand, the lion had disappeared. That puzzled him greatly. He crept round the back of the tent, where there was a little clearing. There, sure enough, was the lion, busily practicing low jumps. This was received with a roar of applause. I drank some champagne. On another occasion, I remarked, this friend of mine had a second curious experience. He was trekking across country, and being anxious to arrive at his destination before the heat of the day, he ordered his boys to inspan whilst it was still dark. They had some trouble in doing so, as the mules were very restive, but at last they managed it, and a start is made. The mules raced along like the wind, and when daylight came they saw why. In the darkness, the boys had inspanned a lion as the near wheeler. This, too, was well received, a ripple of merriment going round the table, but I am not sure that the greatest tribute did not come from my friend, the Labour member, who remained pale and serious. My God, he said anxiously. Who unharnessed them? I must go to Rhodesia, said Mrs. Blair. After what you have told us, Colonel Race, I simply must. It's a horrible journey though, 5 days in the train. You must join me on my private car, I said gallantly. Oh, Sir Eustace, how sweet of you, do you really mean it? Do I mean it? I exclaimed reproachfully, and drank another glass of champagne. Just about another week, and we shall be in South Africa, sighed Mrs. Blair. Ah, South Africa, I said sentimentally, and began to quote from a recent speech of mine at the Colonial Institute. What has South Africa to show the world? What indeed? Her fruit and her farms, her wool and her wattles, her herds and her hides, her gold and her diamonds was hurrying on, because I knew that as soon as I paused Reeves would butt in and inform me that the hides were worthless because the animals hung themselves up on barbed wire or something of that sort, would crab everything else, and end up with the hardships of the miners on the Rand. And I was not in the mood to be abused as a capitalist. However, the interruption came from another source at the magic word diamonds. Diamonds, said Mrs. Blair ecstatically. Diamonds, breathed Miss Bedingfeld. They both addressed Colonel Race. I suppose you've been to Kimberley. I had been to Kimberley too, but I didn't manage to say so in time. Race was being inundated with questions. What were mines like? Was it true that the natives were kept shut up in compounds? And so on. Race answered their questions and showed a good knowledge of his subject. He described the methods of housing the natives, the searches instituted, and the various precautions that De Beers took. Then it's practically impossible to steal any diamonds, asked Mrs. Blair with as keen an air of disappointment as though she had been journeying there for the express purpose. Nothing's impossible, Mrs. Blair. Thefts do occur like the case I told you of where the Kaffir hid the stone in his wound. Yes, but on a large scale. Once, in recent years. Just before the war, in fact. You must remember the case, peddler. You were in South Africa at the time. I nodded. Tell us, cried Miss Bedingfeld. Oh, do tell us. Race smiled. Very well, you shall have the story. I suppose most of you have heard of Sir Lawrence Eardsley, the great South African mining magnate? His mines were gold mines, but he comes into the story through his son. You may remember that just before the war rumors were afield of a new potential Kimberley hidden somewhere in the rocky floor of the British Guiana jungles. Two young explorers, so it was reported, had returned from that part of South America bringing with them a remarkable collection of rough diamonds, some of them of considerable size. Diamonds of small size had been found before in the neighborhood of the Essequibo and Mazarani rivers, but these two young men, John Eardsley and his friend Lucas, claimed to have discovered beds of great carbon deposits at the common head of two streams. The diamonds were of every color, pink, blue, yellow, green, black, and the purest white. Eardsley and Lucas came to Kimberley where they were to submit their gems to inspection. At the same time a sensational robbery was found to have taken place at De Beers. When sending diamonds to England they are made up into a packet. This remains in the big safe, of which the two keys are held by two different men whilst a third man knows the combination. They are handed to the bank, and the bank send them to England. Each package is worth, roughly, about £100,000. On this occasion, the bank were struck by something a little unusual about the sealing of the packet. It was opened, and found to contain knobs of sugar. Exactly how suspicion came to fasten on John Eardsley I do not know. It was remembered that he had been very wild at Cambridge and that his father had paid his debts more than once. Anyhow, it soon got about that this story of South American diamond fields was all a fantasy. John Eardsley was arrested. In his possession was found a portion of the De Beers diamonds. But the case never came to court. Sir Lawrence Eardsley paid over a sum equal to the missing diamonds and De Beers did not prosecute. Exactly how the robbery was committed has never been known. But the knowledge that his son was a thief broke the old man's heart. He had a stroke shortly afterwards. As for John, his fate was in a way merciful. He enlisted, went to the war, fought there bravely, and was killed, thus wiping out the stain on his name. Sir Lawrence himself had a third stroke and died about a month ago. He died in state and his vast fortune passed to his next of kin, a man whom he hardly knew. The colonel paused. A babble of ejaculations and questions broke out. Something seemed to attract Miss Bedingfeld's attention, and she turned in her chair. At the little gasp she gave, I, too, turned. My new secretary, Rayburn, was standing in the doorway. Under his tan, his face had the pallor of one who has seen a ghost. Evidently Race's story had moved him profoundly. Suddenly conscious of our scrutiny, he turned abruptly and disappeared. Do you know who that is? Asked Anne Bedingfeld abruptly. That's my other secretary, I explained. Mr. Rayburn. He's been seedy up to now. She toyed with the bread by her plate. Has he been your secretary long? Not very long, I said cautiously. But caution is useless with a woman, the more you hold back, the more she presses forward. Anne Bedingfeld made no bones about it. How long? She asked bluntly. Well, I engaged him just before I sailed. Old friend of mine recommended him. She said nothing more, but relapsed into a thoughtful silence. I turned to Race with the feeling that it was my turn to display an interest in his story. Who is Sir Lawrence's next of kin, Race? Do you know? I should say so, he replied, with a smile. I am. Chapter 14, Anne's narrative resumed. It was on the night of the fancy dress dance that I decided that the time had come for me to confide in someone. So far I had played a lone hand and rather enjoyed it. Now suddenly everything was changed. I distrusted my own judgment and for the first time a feeling of loneliness and desolation crept over me. I sat on the edge of my bunk, still in my gypsy dress, and considered the situation. I thought first of Colonel Race. He had seemed to like me. He would be kind, I was sure. And he was no fool. Yet, as I thought it over, I wavered. He was a man of commanding personality. He would take the whole matter out of my hands. And it was my mystery. There were other reasons, too, which I would hardly acknowledge to myself, but which made it inadvisable to confide in Colonel Race. Then I thought of Mrs. Blair. She, too, had been kind to me. I did not delude myself into the belief that that really meant anything. It was probably a mere whim of the moment. All the same, I had it in my power to interest her. She was a woman who had experienced most of the ordinary sensations of life. I proposed to supply her with an extraordinary one. And I liked her ease of manner, her lack of sentimentality, her freedom from any form of affectation. My mind was made up. I decided to seek her out then and there. She would hardly be in bed yet. Then I remembered that I did not know the number of her cabin. My friend, the night stewardess, would probably know. I rang the bell. After some delay it was answered by a man. He gave me the information I wanted. Mrs. Blair's cabin was number 71. He apologized for the delay in answering the bell, but explained that he had all the cabins to attend to. "Where is the stewardess, then?" I asked. "They all go off duty at 10 o'clock. No, I mean the night stewardess." "No stewardess on at night, miss." But a stewardess came the other night about 1 o'clock. "You must have been dreaming, miss. There's no stewardess on duty after 10. He withdrew and I was left to digest this morsel of information. Who was the woman who had come to my cabin on the night of the 22nd? My face grew graver as I realized the cunning and audacity of my unknown antagonists. Then, pulling myself together, I left my own cabin and sought that of Mrs. Blair. I knocked at the door. "Who's that?" called her voice from within. "It's me, Anne Bedingfeld." "Oh, come in, gypsy girl." I entered. A good deal of scattered clothing lay about, and Mrs. Blair herself was draped in one of the loveliest kimonos I had ever seen. It was all orange and gold and black and made my mouth water to look at it. "Mrs. Blair," I said abruptly, "I want to tell you the story of my life, that is, if it isn't too late, and you won't be bored." "Not a bit. I always hate going to bed," said Mrs. Blair, her face crinkling into smiles in the delightful UI it had. "And I should love to hear the story of your life. You're a most unusual creature, gypsy girl. Nobody else would think of bursting in on me at 1 a.m. to tell me the story of their life. Especially after snubbing my natural curiosity for weeks as you have done. I'm not accustomed to being snubbed. It's been quite a pleasing novelty. Sit clomey on the sofa and unburden your soul." I told her the whole story. It took some time as I was conscientious over all the details. She gave a deep sigh when I had finished, but she did not say at all what I had expected her to say. Instead she looked at me, laughed a little and said, "Do you know, Anne, you're a very unusual girl. Haven't you ever had qualms?" "Qualms?" I asked, puzzled. "Yes, qualms, qualms, qualms. Starting off alone with practically no money. What will you do when you find yourself in a strange country with all your money gone? It's no good bothering about that until it comes. I've got plenty of money still. The £25 that Mrs. Fleming gave me is practically intact, and then I won the sweep yesterday. That's another £15. Why, I've got lots of money. £40. Lots of money. My God," murmured Mrs. Blair. "One couldn't do it, Anne, and I've plenty of pluck in my own way. I couldn't start off gaily with a few pounds in my pocket and no idea as to what I was doing and where I was going. But that's the fun of it," I cried, thoroughly roused. "It gives one such a splendid feeling of adventure." She looked at me, nodded once or twice, and then smiled. "Lucky Anne. There aren't many people in the world, though, feel as you do." "Well," I said impatiently, "what do you think of it all, Mrs. Blair?" "I think it's the most thrilling thing I ever heard. Now, to begin with, you will stop calling me Mrs. Blair. Suzanne will be ever so much better. Is that agreed?" "I should love it," Suzanne. Good girl. Now let's get down to business. You say that in Sir Eustace's secretary, not that long-faced Paget, the other one, you recognized the man who was stabbed and came into your cabin for shelter. I nodded. That gives us two links connecting Sir Eustace with the tangle. The woman was murdered in his house, and it's his secretary though gets stabbed at the mystic hour of 1 o'clock. I don't suspect Sir Eustace himself, but it can't be all coincidence. There's a connection somewhere even if he himself is unaware of it. Then there's the queer business of the stewardess, she continued thoughtfully. What was she like? I hardly noticed her. I was so excited and strung up, and a stewardess seemed such an anticlimax. But yes, I did think her face was familiar. Of course it would be if I'd seen her about the ship. Her face seemed familiar to you, said Suzanne. Sure she wasn't a man. She was very tall, I admitted. Hardly Sir Eustace, I should think, nor Mr. Paget. Wait. She caught up a scrap of paper and began drawing feverishly. She inspected the result with her head poised on one side. A very good likeness of the Reverend Edward Chichester. Now for the et ceteras. She passed the paper over to me. Is that your stewardess? Why, yes, I cried. Suzanne, how clever of you. She disdained the compliment with a light gesture. I've always had suspicions of that Chichester creature. Do you remember how he dropped his coffee cup and turned a sickly green when we were discussing Crippen the other day? And he tried to get cabin 17. Yes, it all fits in so far. But what does it all mean? What was really meant to happen at 1 o'clock in cabin 17? It can't be the stabbing of the secretary. There would be no point in timing that for a special hour on a special day in a special place. No, it must have been some kind of appointment, and he was on his way to keep it when they knifed him. But who was the appointment with? Certainly not with you. It might have been with Chichester. Or it might have been with Paget. That seems unlikely, I objected. They can see each other any time. We both sat silent for a minute or two, then Suzanne started off on another tack. Could there have been anything hidden in the cabin? That seems more probable, I agreed. It would explain my things being ransacked the next morning. But there was nothing hidden there, I'm sure of it. The young man couldn't have slipped something into a drawer the night before. I shook my head. I should have seen him. Could it have been your precious piece of paper they were looking? It might have been, but it seems rather senseless. It was only a time and a date, and they were both passed by then. Suzanne nodded. That's so, of course. No, it wasn't the paper. By the way, have you got it with you? I'd rather like to see it. I had brought the paper with me as Exhibit A, and I handed it over to her. She scrutinized it, frowning. There's a dot after the 17. Why isn't there a dot after the 1 too? There's a space, I pointed out. Yes, there's a space, but suddenly she rose and peered at the paper, holding it as close under the light as possible. There was a repressed excitement in her manner. Anne, that isn't a dot. That's a flaw in the paper. A flaw in the paper, you see? So you've got to ignore it, and just go by the spaces, the spaces. I had risen and was standing by her. I read out the figures as I now saw them. 171-22. You see, said Suzanne, it's the same, but not quite. It's 1 o'clock still, and the 22 ND, but it's cabin 71. My cabin, Anne. We stood staring at each other, so pleased with our new discovery and so rapt with excitement that you might have thought we had solved the whole mystery. Then I fell to earth with a bump. But, Suzanne, nothing happened here at 1 o'clock on the 22 ND. Her face fell also. No, it didn't. Another idea struck me. This isn't your own cabin, is it, Suzanne? I mean, not the one you originally booked. No, the purser changed me into it. I wonder if it was booked before sailing for someone who didn't turn up. I suppose we could find out. We don't need to find out, gypsy girl, cried Suzanne. I know. The purser was telling me about it. The cabin is booked in the name of Mrs. Gray, but it seems that Nears. Gray was merely a pseudonym for the famous Madame Nadina. She's a celebrated Russian dancer, you know. She's never appeared in London, but Paris has been quite mad about her. She had a terrific success there all through the war. A thoroughly bad lot, I believe, but most attractive. The purser expressed his regrets that she wasn't on board in a most heartfelt fashion when he gave me her cabin, and then Colonel Race told me a lot about her. It seems there were very queer stories afloat in Paris. She was suspected of espionage, but they couldn't prove anything. I rather fancy Colonel Race was over there simply on that account. He's told me some very interesting things. There was a regular organized gang, not German in origin at all. In fact, the head of it, a man always referred to as the Colonel, is thought to be an Englishman, but they never got any clue as to his identity. But there is no doubt that he controlled a considerable organization of international crooks. Robberies, espionages, assaults, he undertook them all and usually provided an innocent scapegoat to pay the penalty. Diabolically clever, he must have been. This woman was supposed to be one of his agents, but they couldn't get hold of anything to go upon. Yes, Anne, we're on the right tack. Nadina is just the woman to be mixed up in this business. The appointment on the morning of the 22nd was with her in this cabin. But where is she? Why didn't she sail? A light flashed upon me. She meant to sail, I said slowly. Then why didn't she? Because she was dead. Suzanne, Nadina, as the woman murdered at Marlow. My mind went back to the bare room in the empty house, and there swept over me again that indefinable sensation of menace and evil. With it came the memory of the falling pencil and the discovery of the roll of films. A roll of films that struck a more recent note. Where had I heard of a roll of films? And why did I connect that thought with Mrs. Blair? Suddenly I flew at her and almost shook her in my excitement. Your films? The ones that were passed to you through the ventilator? Wasn't that on the 22ND? The ones I lost. How do you know they were the same? Why would anyone return them to you that way in the middle of the night? It's a mad idea. No, they were a message. The films had been taken out of the yellow tin case, and something else put inside. Have you got it still? I may have used it. No, here it is. I remember I tossed it into the rack at the side of the bunk. She held it out to me. It was an ordinary round tin cylinder, such as films are packed in for the tropics. I took it with trembling hand, but even as I did so my heart leapt. It was noticeably heavier than it should have been. With shaking fingers I peeled off the strip of adhesive plaster that kept it airtight. I pulled off the lid, and a stream of dull glassy pebbles rolled onto the bed. Pebbles, I said, keenly disappointed. Pebbles, cried Suzanne. The ring in her voice excited me. Pebbles? No, Anne, not pebbles. Diamonds. Chapter 15 Diamonds. I stared, fascinated, at the glassy heap on the bunk. I picked up one which, but for the weight, might have been a fragment of broken bottle. Are you sure, Suzanne? Oh, yes, my dear. I've seen rough diamonds too often to have any doubts. They're beauties too, Anne, and some of them are unique, I should say. There's a history behind these. The history we heard tonight, I cried. You mean __. Colonel Race's story. It can't be a coincidence. He told it for a purpose. To see its effect, you mean? I nodded. Its effect on Sir Eustace. Yes. But, even as I said it, a doubt assailed me. Was it Sir Eustace who had been subjected to a test, or had the story been told for my benefit? I remembered the impression I had received on that former night of having been deliberately pumped. For some reason or other, Colonel Race was suspicious. But where did he come in? What possible connection could he have with the affair? Who is Colonel Race? I asked. That's rather a question, said Suzanne. He's pretty well as a big game hunter, and, as you heard him say tonight, he was a distant cousin of Sir Lawrence Eardsley. I've never actually met him until this trip. He journeys to and from Africa a good deal. There's a general idea that he does Secret Service work. I don't know whether it's true or not. He's certainly rather a mysterious creature. I suppose he came into a lot of money as Sir Lawrence Eardsley's heir. My dear Anne, he must be rolling. You know, he'd be a splendid match for you. I can't have a good go at him with you aboard the ship, I said, laughing. Oh, these married women. We do have a pull, murmured Suzanne complacently. And everybody knows that I am absolutely devoted to Clarence, my husband, you know. It's so safe and pleasant to make love to a devoted wife. It must be very nice for Clarence to be married to someone like you. Well, I'm wearing to live with. Still, he can always escape to the Foreign Office, where he fixes his eyeglass in his eye, and goes to sleep in a big armchair. We might cable him to tell us all he knows about race. I love sending cables. And they annoy Clarence so. He always says a letter would have done as well. I don't suppose he'd tell us anything, though. He is so frightfully discreet. That's what makes him so hard to live with for long on end. But let us go on with our matchmaking. I'm sure Colonel Race is very attracted to you, Anne. Give him a couple of glances from those wicked eyes of yours, and the deed is done. Everyone gets engaged on board ship. There's nothing else to do. I don't want to get married. Don't you? Said Suzanne. Why not? I love being married even to Clarence. I disdained her flippancy. What I want to know is, I said with determination, what has Colonel Race got to do with this? He's in it somewhere. You don't think it was mere chance, his telling that story? No, I don't, I said decidedly. He was watching us all narrowly. You remember, some of the diamonds were recovered, not all. Perhaps these are the missing ones, or perhaps what? I did not answer directly. I should like to know, I said, had became of the other young man. Not Eardsley, but what was his name? Lucas. We're getting some light on the thing, anyway. It's the diamonds all these people are after. It must have been to obtain possession of the diamonds that the man in the brune suit killed Nadina. He didn't kill her, I said sharply. Of course he killed her. Who else could have done so? I don't know. But I'm sure he didn't kill her. He went into that house 3 minutes after her and came out as white as a sheet. Because he found her dead. But nobody else went in. Then the murderer was in the house already, or else he got in some other way. There's no need for him to pass the lodge, he could have climbed over the wall. Suzanne glanced at me sharply. The man in the brune suit, she mused. Who was he, I wonder? Anyway, he was identical with the doctor in the tube. He would have had time to remove his makeup and follow the woman to Marlow. She and Carton were to have met there. They both had an order to view the same house, and if they took such elaborate precautions to make their meeting appear accidental, they must have suspected they were being followed. All the same, Carton did not know that his shadower was the man in the Bromell suit. When he recognized him, the shock was so great that he lost his head completely and stepped back onto the line. That all seems pretty clear, don't you think so, Anne? I did not reply. Yes, that's how it was. He took the paper from the dead man, and in his hurry to get away he dropped it. Then he followed the woman to Marlow. What did he do when he left there, when he had killed her or, according to you, found her dead? Where did he go? Still I said nothing. I wonder, now, said Suzanne musingly. Is it possible that he induced Sir Eustace Pedlar to bring him on board as his secretary? It would be a unique chance of getting safely out of England, and dodging the hue and cry. But how did he square Sir Eustace? It looks as though he had some hold over him. Or over Paget, I suggested in spite of myself. You don't seem to like Paget, Anne. Sir Eustace says he's a most capable and hard-working young man. And, really, he may be for all we know against him. Well, to continue my surmises. Rayburn is the man in the brune suit. He had read the paper he dropped. Therefore, misled by thought as you were, he attempts to reach cabin 17 at 1 o'clock on the 22nd, having previously tried to get possession of the cabin through Paget. On the way there somebody knifes him. Who? I interpolated. Chichester. Yes, it all fits in. Cable to Lord Nasby that you have found the man in the Bromell suit, and your fortune's made, Anne. There are several things you've overlooked. What things? Rayburn's got a scar, I know, but a scar can be faked easily enough. He's the right height and build. What's the description of a head with which you pulverized them at Scotland Yard? I trembled. Suzanne was a well-educated, well-read woman, but I prayed that she might not be conversant with technical terms of anthropology. Dolichocephalic, I said lightly. Suzanne looked doubtful. Was that it? Yes. Long-headed, you know. A head whose width is less than 75% of its length, I explained fluently. There was a pause. I was just me to breathe freely when Suzanne said suddenly, "What's the opposite?" "What do you mean the opposite?" "Well, there must be an opposite. What do you call the heads whose breadth is more than 75% of their length?" "Brachycephalic," I murmured unwillingly. "That's it. I thought that was what you said." "Did I?" It was a slip of the tongue. "I meant dolichocephalic," I said with all the assurance I could muster. Suzanne looked at me searchingly. Then she laughed. "You lie very well, gypsy girl. But it'll save time and trouble now if you tell me all about it." "There's nothing to tell," I said unwillingly. "Isn't there?" said Suzanne gently. "I suppose I shall have to tell you," I said slowly. "I'm not ashamed of it." "You can't be ashamed of something that just happens to you. That's what he did. He was detestable, rude and ungrateful, but that I think I understand. It's like a dog that's been chained up or badly treated, it'll bite anybody. That's what he was like, bitter and snarling. I don't know why I care, but I do. I care horribly. Just seeing him has turned my whole life upside down. I love him. I want him. I'll walk all over Africa barefoot till I find him, and I'll make him care for me. I'd die for him. I'd work for him, slave for him, steal for him, even beg or borrow for him. There now, you know." Suzanne looked at me for a long time. "You're very un-English, gypsy girl," she said at last. "There's not a scrap of the sentimental about you. I've never met anyone who was at once so practical and so passionate. I shall never care for anyone like that, mercifully for me, and yet I envy you, gypsy girl. It's something to be able to care. Most people can't. But what a mercy for your little doctor man that you didn't marry him. He doesn't sound at all the sort of individual who would enjoy keeping high explosive in the house. So there's to be no cabling to Lord Nasby." I shook my head. "And yet you believe him to be innocent." "I also believe that innocent people can be hanged." "Yes. But, Anne dear, you can face facts, face them now. In spite of all you say, he may have murdered this woman." "No," I said. "He didn't. That's sentiment." "No, it isn't. He might have killed her. He may even have followed her there with that idea in his mind. But he wouldn't take a bit of black cord and strangle her with it. If he'd done it, he would have strangled her with his bare hands." Suzanne gave a little shiver. Her eyes narrowed appreciatively. "Anne, I am beginning to see why you find this young man of yours so attractive." Chapter 16. I got an opportunity of tackling Colonel Race on the following morning. The auction of the sweep had just been concluded, and we walked up and down the deck together. "How's the gypsy this morning? Longing for land in her caravan?" I shook my head. "Now that the sea is behaving so nicely, I feel I should like to stay on it forever and ever." "What enthusiasm! Well, isn't it lovely this morning?" We leaned together over the rail. It was a glassy calm. The sea looked as though it had been oiled. There were great patches of color on it, blue, pale green, emerald, purple and deep orange, like a cubist picture. There was an occasional flash of silver that showed the flying fish. The air was moist and warm, almost sticky. Its breath was like a perfumed caress. "That was a very interesting story you told us last night," I said, breaking the silence. "Which one?" "The one about the diamonds. I believe women are always interested in diamonds." "Of course we are. By the way, what became of the other young man? You said there were two of them. Young Lucas? Well, of course, they couldn't prosecute one without the other, so he went scot-free too. And what happened to him eventually, I mean? Oh yes, anyone know? Colonel Race was looking straight ahead of him out to sea. His face was as devoid of expression as a mask, but I had an idea that he did not like my questions. Nevertheless, he replied readily enough, he went to the war and acquitted himself bravely. He was reported missing and wounded, believed killed. That told me what I wanted to know. I asked no more. But more than ever I wondered how much Colonel Race knew. The part he was playing in all this puzzled me. One other thing I did. That was to interview the night steward. With a little financial encouragement, I soon got him to talk. The lady wasn't frightened, was she, miss? It seemed a harmless sort of joke. A bet, or so I understood. I got it all out of him, little by little. On the voyage from Cape Town to England, one of the passengers had handed him a roll of films with instructions that they were to be dropped onto the bunk in cabin 71 at 1 a.m. on January 22 on the outward journey. A lady would be occupying the cabin, and the affair was described as a bet. I gathered that the steward had been liberally paid for his part in the transaction. The lady's name had not been mentioned. Of course, as Mrs. Blair went straight into cabin 71, interviewing the purser as soon as she got on board, it never occurred to the steward that she was not the lady in question. The name of the passenger who had arranged the transaction was Carton, and his description tallied exactly with that of the man killed on the tube. So one mystery, at all events, was cleared up, and the diamonds were obviously the key to the whole situation. Those last days on the Kilmorden seemed to pass very quickly. As we drew nearer and nearer to Cape Town, I was forced to consider carefully my future plans. There were so many people I wanted to keep an eye on. Mr. Chichester, Sir Eustace, and his secretary, and yes, Colonel Race. What was I to do about it? Naturally it was Chichester who had first claim on my attention. Indeed, I was on the point of reluctantly dismissing Sir Eustace and Mr. Paget from their position of suspicious characters, when a chance conversation awakened fresh doubts in my mind. I had not forgotten Mr. Paget's incomprehensible emotion at the mention of Florence. On the last evening on board we were all sitting on deck and Sir Eustace addressed a perfectly innocent question to his secretary. I forget exactly what it was, something to do with railway delays in Italy, but at once I noticed that Mr. Paget was displaying the same uneasiness which had caught my attention before. When Sir Eustace claimed Mrs. Blair for a dance, I quickly moved into the chair next to the secretary. I was determined to get to the bottom of the matter. I have always longed to go to Italy, I said. And especially to Florence. Didn't you enjoy it very much there? Indeed I did, Miss Bedingfeld. If you will excuse me, there is some correspondence of Sir Eustace's that I took hold of him firmly by his coat sleeve. Oh, you mustn't run away, I cried with the skittish accent of an elderly dowager. I'm sure Sir Eustace wouldn't like you to leave me alone with no one to talk to. You never seem to want to talk about Florence. Oh, Mr. Paget, I believe you have a guilty secret. I still had my hand on his arm, and I could feel the sudden start he gave. Not at all, Miss Bedingfeld, not at all, he said earnestly. I should be only too delighted to tell you all about it, but there really are some cables. Oh, Mr. Paget, what a thin pretence. I shall tell Sir Eustace. I got no further. He gave another jump. The man's nerves seemed in a shocking state. What is it you want to know? The resigned martyrdom of his tone made me smile inwardly. Oh, everything. The pictures, the olive trees. I paused, rather at a loss myself. I suppose you speak Italian? I resumed. Not a word, unfortunately. But of course, with hall porters and guides. Exactly, I hastened to reply. And which was your favorite picture? Oh, the Madonna Raphael, you know. Dear old Florence, I murmured sentimentally. So picturesque on the banks of the Arno. A beautiful river. And the Duomo, you remember the Duomo? Of course, of course. Another beautiful river, is it not? I hazarded. Almost more beautiful than the Arno. Decidedly so, I should say. Emboldened by the success of my little trap, I proceeded further. But there was little room for doubt. Mr. Paget delivered himself into my hands with every word he uttered. The man had never been in Florence in his life. But, if not in Florence, here had he been. In England. Actually in England at the time of the Mill House mystery? I decided on a bold step. The curious thing is, I said, that I fancied I had seen you before somewhere. But I must be mistaken since you were in Florence at the time. And yet I studied him frankly. There was a hunted look in his eyes. He passed his tongue over his dry lips. Clyde, I think I had seen you. I finished for him. At Marlow. You know Marlow? Why, of course, how stupid of me, Sir Eustace has a house there. But with an incoherent muttered excuse, my victim rose and fled. That night I invaded Suzanne's cabin, alight with excitement. You see, Suzanne, I urged, as I finished my tale, he was in England, in Marlow, at the time of the murder. Are you so sure now that, the man in the brown suit, is guilty? I'm sure of one thing, said Suzanne, twinkling unexpectedly. What's that? That, the man in the brown suit, is better looking than poor Mr. Paget. No, Anne, don't get cross. I was only teasing. Sit down here. Joking apart, I think you've made a very important discovery. Up till now, we've considered Paget as having an alibi. Now we know he hasn't. Exactly, I said. We must keep an eye on him. As well as everybody else, she said ruefully. Well, that's one of the things I wanted to talk to you about. That and finance. No, don't stick your nose in the air. I know you are absurdly proud and independent, but you've got to listen to horse sense over this. We're partners. I wouldn't offer you a penny because I liked you, or because you're a friendless girl. What I want is a thrill, and I'm prepared to pay for it. We're going into this together regardless of expense. To begin with, you'll come with me to the Mount Nelson Hotel at my expense, and we'll plan out our campaign. We argued the point. In the end I gave in. But I didn't like it. I wanted to do the thing on my own. That's settled, said Suzanne at last, getting up and stretching herself with a big yawn. I'm exhausted with my own eloquence. Now then, let us discuss our victims. Mr. Chichester is going on to Durban. Sir Eustace is going to the Mount Nelson Hotel in Cape Town and then up to Rhodesia. He's going to have a private car on the railway, and in a moment of expansion, after his fourth glass of champagne the other night, he offered me a place in it. I dare say he didn't really mean it, but, all the same, he can't very well back out if I hold him to it. Good, I approved. You keep an eye on Sir Eustace and Paget, and I take on Chichester. But what about Colonel Race? Suzanne looked at me queerly. Anne, you can't possibly suspect. I do. I suspect everybody. I'm in the mood when one looks round for the most unlikely person. Colonel Race is going to Rhodesia too, said Suzanne thoughtfully. If we could arrange for Sir Eustace to invite him also, you can manage it. You can manage anything. I love butter, purred Suzanne. We parted on the understanding that Suzanne should employ her talents to the best advantage. I felt too excited to go to bed immediately. It was my last night on board. Early tomorrow morning we should be in Table Bay. I slipped up on deck. The breeze was fresh and cool. The boat was rolling a little in the choppy sea. The decks were dark and deserted. It was after midnight. I leaned over the rail, watching the phosphorescent trail of foam. Ahead of us lay Africa, we were rushing towards it through the dark water. I felt alone in a wonderful world. Wrapped in a strange peace, I stood there, taking no heed of time, lost in a dream. And suddenly I had a curious intimate premonition of danger. I had heard nothing, but I swung round instinctively. A shadowy form had crept up behind me. As I turned, it sprang. One hand gripped my throat, stifling any cry I might have uttered. I fought desperately, but I had no chance. I was half choking from the grip on my throat, but I bit and clung and scratched in the most approved feminine fashion. The man was handicapped by having to keep me from crymg out. If he had succeeded in reaching me unawares, it would have been easy enough for him to sling me overboard with a sudden heave. The sharks would have taken care of the rest. Struggle as I would, I felt myself weakening. My assailant felt it too. He put out all his strength. And then, running on swift noiseless feet, another shadow joined in. With one blow of his fist, he sent my opponent crashing headlong to the deck. Released, I fell back against the rail, sick and trembling. My rescuer turned to me with a quick movement. "You're hurt." There was something savage in his tone, a menace against the person who had dared to hurt me. Even before he spoke I had recognized him. It was my man, the man with the scar. But that one moment in which his attention had been diverted to me had been enough for the fallen enemy. Quick as a flash he had risen to his feet and taken to his heels down the deck. With an oath Rayburn sprang after him. I always hate being out of things. I joined the chase a bad third. Round the deck we went to the starboard side of the ship. There by the saloon door lay the man in a crumpled heap. Rayburn was bending over him. "Did you hit him again?" I called breathlessly. "There was no need," he replied grimly. "I found him collapsed by the door. Or else he couldn't get it open and is shamming. We'll soon see about that. And we'll see who he is too." With a beating heart I drew near. I had realized at once that my assailant was a bigger man than Chichester. Anyway, Chichester was a flabby creature though might use a knife at a pinch, but who would have little strength in his bare hands. Rayburn struck a match. We both uttered an ejaculation. The man was Guy Paget. Rayburn appeared absolutely stupefied by the discovery. "Paget," he muttered. "My God, Paget." I felt a slight sense of superiority. "You seem surprised." "I am," he said heavily. "I never suspected." He wheeled suddenly round on me. "And you? You're not? You recognized him, I suppose, when he attacked you?" "No, I didn't." "All the same, I'm not so very surprised." He stared at me suspiciously. "Where do you come in, I wonder? And how much do you know?" I smiled. "A good deal, Mr. Lucas." He caught my arm. The unconscious strength of his grip made me wince. "Where did you get that name?" he asked hoarsely. "Isn't it yours?" I demanded sweetly. "Or do you prefer to be called the man in the Bromell suit?" That did stagger him. He released my arm and fell back a pace or two. "Are you a girl or a witch?" he breathed. "I'm a friend." I advanced a step towards him. "I offered you my help once, I offer it again. Will you have it?" The fierceness of his answer took me aback. "No. I'll have no truck with you or with any woman. Do your damnedest." As before, my temper began to rise. "Perhaps," I said, "you don't realize how much in my power you are? A word from me to the captain, say it," he sneered. Then advancing with a quick step, "And whilst we're realizing things, my girl, do you realize that you're in my power this minute? I could take you by the throat like this." With a swift gesture he suited the action to the word. I felt his two hands clasp my throat and press ever so little. "Like this and squeeze the life out of you. And then like our unconscious friend here, but with more success fling your dead body to the sharks. What do you say to that?" I said nothing. I laughed. And yet I knew that the danger is real. Just at that moment he hated me. But I knew that I loved the danger, loved the feeling of his hands on my throat. That I would not have exchanged that moment for any other moment in my life. With a short laugh he released me. "What's your name?" he asked abruptly. "Anne Bedingfeld." "Does nothing frighten you, Anne Bedingfeld?" "Oh, yes," I said, with an assumption of coolness I was far from feeling. "Wasps, sarcastic women, very young men, cockroaches, and superior shop assistants." He gave the same short laugh as before. Then he stirred the unconscious form of Paget with his feet. "What shall we do with this junk?" "Throw it overboard," he asked carelessly. "If you like," I answered with equal calm. "I admire your wholehearted, bloodthirsty instincts, Miss Bedingfeld. But we will leave him to recover at his leisure. He is not seriously hurt. You shrink from a second murder, I see, I said sweetly. A second murder? He looked genuinely puzzled. The woman at Marlowe, I reminded him, watching the effect of my words closely. An ugly brooding expression settled down on his face. He seemed to have forgotten my presence. I might have killed her, he said. Sometimes I believe that I meant to kill her. A wild rush of feeling, hatred of the dead woman, surged through me. I could have killed her that moment, had she stood before me. For he must have loved her once, he must to have felt like that. I regained control of myself and spoke in my normal voice. We seem to have said all there is to be said except good night. Good night and goodbye, Miss Bedingfeld. Au revoir, Mr. Lucas. Again he flinched at the name. He came nearer. Why do you say that au revoir, I mean? Because I have a fancy that we shall meet again. Not if I can help it. Emphatic as his tone was, it did not offend me. On the contrary, I hugged myself with secret satisfaction. I am not quite a fool. All the same, I said gravely, I think we shall. Why? I shook my head, unable to explain the feeling that had actuated my words. I never wish to see you again, he said suddenly and violently. It was really a very rude thing to say, but I only laughed softly and slipped away into the darkness. I heard him start after me, and then pause, and a word floated down the deck. I think it was a witch. Chapter 17, Extract from the Cherry of S.W. Eustace Pedler, Mount Nelson Hotel, Cape Town. It is really the greatest relief to get off the Kilmorden. The whole time that I was on board I was conscious of being surrounded by a network of intrigue. To put the lid on everything, Guy Paget must needs engage in a drunken brawl the last night. It is all very well to explain it away, but that is what it actually amounts to. What else would you think if a man comes to you with a lump the size of an egg on the side of his head and an eye colored all the tints of the rainbow? Of course Paget would insist on trying to be mysterious about the whole thing. According to him, you would think his black eye was the direct result of his devotion to my interests. His story was extraordinarily vague and rambling, and it was a long time before I could make head or tail of it. To begin with, it appears he caught sight of a man behaving suspiciously. Those are Paget's words. He has taken them straight from the pages of a German spy story. What he means by a man behaving suspiciously he doesn't know himself. I said so to him. He was slinking along in a very furtive manner, and it was the middle of the night, Sir Eustace. Well, what were you doing yourself? Why weren't you in bed and asleep like a good Christian? I demanded irritably. I had been coding those cables of yours, Sir Eustace, and typing the diary up to date. Trust Paget to be always in the right and a martyr over it. Well, I just thought I would have a look around before turning in, Sir Eustace. The man was coming down the passage from your cabin. I thought at once there was something wrong by the he looked about him. He slunk up the stairs by the saloon. I followed him. My dear Paget, I said, why shouldn't the poor chap go on deck without having his footsteps dogged? Lots of people even sleep on deck very uncomfortable, I've always thought. The sailors wash you down with the rest of the deck at 5 in the morning. I shuddered at the idea. Anyway, I continued, if you went worrying some poor devil who was suffering from insomnia, I don't wonder he landed you one. Paget looked patient. If you would hear me out, Sir Eustace. I was convinced the man had been prowling about near your cabin where he had no business to be. The only two cabins close that passage are yours and Colonel Race's. Race, I said, lighting a cigar carefully, can look after himself without your assistance, Paget. I added as an afterthought, so can I. Paget came nearer and breathed heavily as he always does before imparting a secret. You see, Sir Eustace, I fancied and now indeed I am sure it was Rayburn. Rayburn? Yes, Sir Eustace. I shook my head. Rayburn has far too much sense to attempt to wake me up in the middle of the night. Quite so, Sir Eustace. I think it was Colonel Race he went to see. A secret meeting for orders. Don't hiss at me, Paget, I said, drawing back a little, and do control your breathing. Your idea is absurd. Why should they want to have a secret meeting in the middle of the night? If they'd anything to say to each other, they could hobnob over beef tea in a perfectly casual and natural manner. I could see that Paget was not in the least convinced. Something was going on last night, Sir Eustace, he urged. Should Raeburn assault me so brutally? You're quite sure it was Raeburn? Or why? Paget appeared to be perfectly convinced of that. It was the only part of the story that he wasn't vague about. There's something very queer about all this, he said. To begin with, where is Raeburn? It's perfectly true that we haven't seen the fellow since we came on shore. He did not come up to the hotel with us. I decline to believe that he is afraid of Paget, however. Altogether the whole thing is very annoying. One of my secretaries has vanished into the blue, and the other looks like a disreputable prize fighter. I can't take him about with me in his present condition. I shall be the laughing stock of Cape Town. I have an appointment later in the day to deliver old Milray's billet doux, but I shall not take Paget with me. Confound the fellow and his prowling ways. Altogether I am decidedly out of temper. I had poisonous breakfast with poisonous people. Dutch waitresses with thick ankles who took half an hour to bring me a bad bit of fish. And this farce of getting up at 5 a.m. on arrival at the port to see a blinking doctor and hold your hands above your head simply makes me tired. Later. A very serious thing has occurred. I went to my appointment with the Prime Minister, taking Milray's sealed letter. It didn't look as though it had been tampered with, but inside was a blank sheet of paper. Now, I suppose, I'm in the devil of a mess. Why I ever let that bleeding old fool Milray embroil me in the matter I can't think. Paget is a famous job's comforter. He displays a certain gloomy satisfaction that maddens me. Also, he has taken advantage of my perturbation to saddle me with the stationary trunk. Unless he is careful, the next funeral he attends will be his own. However, in the end I had to listen to him. Supposing, Sir Eustace, that Raeburn had overheard a word or two of your conversation with Mr. Milray in the street. Remember, you had no written authority from Mr. Milray. You accepted Raeburn on his own valuation. You think Raeburn is a crook, then? I said slowly. Paget did. How far his views were influenced by resentment over his black eye I don't know. He made out a pretty fair case against Raeburn. And the appearance of the latter told against him. My idea was to do nothing in the matter. A man who has permitted himself to be made a thorough fool of is not anxious to broadcast the fact. But Paget, his energy unimpaired by his recent misfortunes, was all for vigorous measures. He had his way, of course. He bustled out to the police station, sent innumerable cables, and brought a herd of English and Dutch officials to drink whiskies and sodas at my expense. We got Milray's answer that evening. He knew nothing of my late secretary. There was only one spot of comfort to be extracted from the situation. At any rate, I said to Paget, you weren't poisoned. You had one of your ordinary bilious attacks. I saw him wince. It was my only score. Later. Paget is in his element. His brain positively scintillates with bright ideas. He will have it now that Raeburn is none other than the famous man in the Bruin suit. I dare say he is right. He usually is. But all this is getting unpleasant. The sooner I get off to Rhodesia the better. I have explained to Paget that he is not to accompany me. You see, my dear fellow, I said, you must remain here on the spot. You might be required to identify Raeburn any minute. And, besides, I have my dignity as an English member of Parliament to think of. I can't go about with a secretary who has apparently recently been indulging in a vulgar street brawl. Paget winced. He is such a respectable fellow that his appearance is pain and tribulation to him. But what will you do about your correspondence and the notes for your speeches, Sir Eustace? I shall manage, I said airily. Your private car is to be attached to the 11 o'clock train tomorrow, Wednesday, morning, Paget continued. I have made all arrangements. Is Mrs. Blair taking a maid with her? Mrs. Blair? I gasped. She tells me you offered her a place. So I did, now I come to think of it. On the night of the fancy dress ball. I even urged her to come. But I never thought she would. Delightful as she is, I do not know that I want Mrs. Blair's society all the way to Rhodesia and back. Women require such a lot of attention. And they are confoundedly in the way sometimes. Have I asked anyone else? I said nervously. One does these things in moments of expansion. Mrs. Blair seemed to think you had asked Colonel Race as well. I groaned. I must have been very drunk if I asked Race. Very drunk indeed. Take my advice, Paget, and let your black eye be a warning to you, don't go on the bust again. As you know, I am a teetotaler, Sir Eustace. Much wiser to take the pledge if you have a weakness that way. I haven't asked anyone else, have I, Paget? Not that I know of, Sir Eustace. I heaved a sigh of relief. There's Miss Bedingfeld, I said thoughtfully. She wants to get to Rhodesia to dig up bones, I believe. I've a good mind to offer her a temporary job as a secretary. She can typewrite, I know, for she told me to my surprise. Paget opposed the idea vehemently. He does not like Bedingfeld. Ever since the night of the black eye, he has displayed uncontrollable emotion whenever she is mentioned. Paget is full of mysteries nowadays. Just to annoy him, I shall ask the girl. As I said before, she has extremely nice legs. Chapter 18, Anne's narrative resumed. I don't suppose that as long as I live I shall forget my first sight of Table Mountain. I got up frightfully early and went out on deck. I went right up to the boat deck, which I believe is a heinous offense, but I decided to dare something in the cause of solitude. We were just steaming into Table Bay. There were fleecy white clouds hovering above Table Mountain, and nestling on the slopes below, right down to the sea, was the sleeping town, gilded and bewitched by the morning sunlight. It made me catch my breath and have that curious hungry pain inside that seizes one sometimes when one comes across something that's extra beautiful. I'm not very good at expressing these things, but I knew well enough that I had found, if only for a fleeting moment, the thing that I had been looking for ever since I left Little Hampsley. Something new, something hitherto undreamed of, something that satisfied my aching hunger for romance. Perfectly silently, or so it seemed to me, the Kilmorden glided nearer and nearer. It was still very like a dream. Like all dreamers, however, I could not let my dream alone. We poor humans are so anxious not to miss anything. This is South Africa, I kept saying to myself industriously, South Africa, South Africa. You are seeing the world. This is the world. You are seeing it. Think of it, Anne Bedingfeld, you pudding head. You're seeing the world. I had thought that I had the boat deck to myself, but now I observed another figure lean me over the rail, absorbed as I had been in the rapidly approaching city. Even before he turned his head I knew who it was. The scene of last night seemed unreal and melodramatic in the peaceful morning sunlight. What must he have thought of me? It made me hot to realize the things that I had said. And I hadn't meant them, or had I? I turned my head resolutely away and stared hard at Table Mountain. If Rayburn had come up here to be alone, I, at least, need not disturb him by advertising my presence. But to my intense surprise I heard a light footfall on the deck behind me, and then his voice, pleasant and normal, Miss Bedingfeld. Yes. I turned. I want to apologize to you. I behaved like a perfect boor last night. It was a peculiar night, I said hastily. It was not a very lucid remark, but it was absolutely the only thing I could think of. Will you forgive me? I held out my hand without a word. He took it. There's something else I want to say. His gravity deepened. Miss Bedingfeld, you may not know it, but you are mixed up in a rather dangerous business. I gathered as much, I said. No, you don't. You can't possibly know. I want to warn you. Leave the whole thing alone. It can't concern you really. Don't let your curiosity lead you to tamper with other people's business. No, please don't get angry again. I'm not speaking of myself. You've no idea of what you might come up against. These men will stop at nothing. They are absolutely ruthless. Already you're in danger. Look at last night. They fancy you know something. Your only chance is to persuade them that they're mistaken. But be careful, always be on the lookout for danger, and, look here, if at any time you should fall into their hands, don't try and be clever. Tell the whole truth, it will be your only chance. You make my flesh creep, Mr. Rayburn, I said, with some truth. Why do you take the trouble to warn me? He did not answer for some minutes, then he said in a low voice, it may be the last thing I can do for you. Once on shore I shall be all right, but I may not get on shore. What? One cried. You see, I'm afraid you are not the only person on board who knows that I am the man in the brune suit. If you think that I told, I said hotly. He reassured me with a smile. I don't doubt you, Miss Bedingfeld. If I ever said I did, I lied. No, but there's one person on board who's known all along. He's only got to speak and my number's up. All the same, I'm taking a sporting chance that he won't speak. Why? Because he's a man who likes playing a lone hand. And when the police have got me, I should be of no further use to him. Free, I might be. Well, an hour will show. He laughed rather mockingly, but I saw his face harden. If he had gambled with fate, he was a good gambler. He could lose and smile. In any case, he said lightly, I don't suppose we shall meet again. No, I said slowly. I suppose not. So goodbye. Goodbye. He gripped my hand hard. Just for a minute his curious light eyes seemed to burn into mine, then he turned abruptly and left me. I heard his footsteps ringing along the deck. They echoed and re-echoed. I felt that I should hear them always. Footsteps going out of my life. I can admit frankly that I did not enjoy the next 2 hours. Not till I stood on the wharf, having finished with most of the ridiculous formalities that bureaucracies require, did I breathe freely once more. No arrest had been made, and I realized that it was a heavenly day, and that I was extremely hungry. I joined Suzanne. In any case, I was staying the night with her at the hotel. The boat did not go on to Port Elizabeth and Durban until the following morning. We got into a taxi and drove to the Mount Nelson. It was all heavenly. The sun, the air, the flowers. When I thought of Little Hampsley in January, the mud knee-deep, and the sure-to-be falling rain, I hugged myself with delight. Suzanne was not nearly so enthusiastic. She has traveled a great deal, of course. Besides, she is not the type that gets excited before breakfast. She snubbed me severely and I let out an enthusiastic yelp at the sight of a giant blue convolvulus. By the way, I should like to make it clear here and now that this story will not be a story of South Africa. I guarantee no genuine local color, you know, the sort of thing, half a dozen words in italics on every page. I admire it very much, but I can't do it. In South Sea Islands, of course, you make an immediate reference to Bêche-de-Mer. I don't know what Bêche-de-Mer is, I never have known, I probably never shall know. I've guessed once or twice and guessed wrong. In South Africa I know you at once begin to talk about a stoep. I do know what a stoep is. It's the thing round a house and you sit on it. In various other parts of the world you call it a veranda, a piazza, and a ha-ha. Then again, there are pawpaws. I had often read of pawpaws. I discovered at once what they were, because I had one plumped down in front of me for breakfast. I thought at first that it was a melon gone bad. The Dutch waitress enlightened me, and persuaded me to use lemon juice and sugar and try again. I was very pleased to meet a pawpaw. I had always vaguely associated it with a hula-hula, which, I believe, though I may be wrong, is a kind of straw skirt that Hawaiian girls dance in. No, I think I am wrong, that is a lava-lava. At any rate, all these things are very cheering after England. I can't help thinking that it would brighten our cold island life if one could have a breakfast of bacon, and then go out clad in a jumper to pay the books. Suzanne was a little tamer after breakfast. They had given me a room next to hers with a lovely view right out over Table Bay. I looked at the view whilst Suzanne hunted for some special face cream. When she had found it and started an immediate application, she became capable of listening to me. "Did you see Sir Eustace?" I asked. "He was marching out of the breakfast room as we went in. He'd had some bad fish or something and was just telling the head waiter what he thought about it, and he bounced a peach on the floor to show how hard it was, only it wasn't quite as hard as he thought and it squashed." Suzanne smiled. "Sir Eustace doesn't like getting up early any more than I do. But, Anne, did you see Mr. Paget? I ran against him in the passage. He's got a black eye. What can he have been doing?" "Only trying to push me overboard," I replied nonchalantly. It was a distinct score for me. Suzanne left her face half anointed and pressed for details. I gave them to her. "It all gets more and more mysterious," she cried. "I thought I was going to have the soft job sticking to Sir Eustace, and that you would have all the fun with the Reverend Edward Chichester, but now I'm not so sure. I hope Paget won't push me off the train some dark night." "I think you're still above suspicion, Suzanne. But, if the worst happens, I'll wire to Clarence. That reminds me, give me a cable form. Let me see now, what shall I say? Implicated in the most thrilling mystery, please send me £1,000 at once, Suzanne." I took the form from her, and pointed out that she could eliminate a the, an a, and possibly, if she didn't care about being polite, a please. Suzanne, however, appears to be perfectly reckless in money matters. Instead of attending to my economical suggestions, she added 3 words more: "enjoying myself hugely." Suzanne was engaged to lunch with friends of hers, who came to the hotel about 11 o'clock to fetch her. I was left to my own devices. I went down through the grounds of the hotel, crossed the tram lines and followed a cool shady avenue right down till I came to the main street. I strolled about, seeing the sights, enjoying the sunlight and the black-faced sellers of flowers and fruits. I also discovered a place where they had the most delicious ice cream sodas. Finally, I bought a 6-penny basket of peaches and retraced my steps to the hotel. To my surprise and pleasure, I found a note awaiting me. It was from the curator of the museum. He had read of my arrival on the Kilmorden, in which I was described as the daughter of the late Professor Bedingfeld. He had known my father slightly and had had a great admiration for him. He went on to say that his wife would be delighted if I would come out and have tea with them that afternoon at their villa at Muizenberg. He gave me instructions for getting there. It was pleasant to think that poor Papa was still remembered and highly thought of. I foresaw that I would have to be personally escorted round the museum before I left Cape Tommy, but I risked that. To most people it would have been a treat, but one can have too much of a good thing if one is brought up on it, morning, noon and night. I put on my best hat, one of Suzanne's cast-offs, and my least crumpled white linen and started off after lunch. I caught a fast train to Muizenberg and got there in about half an hour. It was a nice trip. We wound slowly round the base of Table Mountain, and some of the flowers were lovely. My geography being weak, I had never fully realized that Cape Town is on a peninsula, consequently I was rather surprised on getting out of the train to find myself facing the sea once more. There was some perfectly entrancing bathing going on. The people had short curved boards and came floating in on the waves. It was far too early to go to tea. I made for the bathing pavilion, and when they said would I have a surfboard, I said yes, please. Surfing looks perfectly easy. It isn't. I say no more. I got very angry and fairly hurled my plank from me. Nevertheless, I determined to return on the first possible opportunity and have another go. I would not be beaten. Quite by mistake I then got a good run on my board, and came out delirious with happiness. Surfing is like that. You are either vigorously cursing or else you are idiotically pleased with yourself. I found the Villa Meggi after some little difficulty. It was right up on the side of the mountain, isolated from the other cottages and villas. I rang the bell, and a smiling Kaffir boy answered it. "Mrs. Ruffini?" I inquired. He ushered me in, preceded me down the passage and flung open a door. Just as I was about to pass in, I hesitated. I felt a sudden misgiving. I stepped over the threshold and the door slung sharply to behind me. A man rose from his seat behind a table and came forward with outstretched hand. "So glad we have persuaded you to visit us, Miss Bedingfeld," he said. He was a tall man, obviously a Dutchman, with a flaming orange beard. He did not look in the least like the curator of a museum. In fact, I realized in a flash that I had made a fool of myself. I was in the hands of the enemy. Chapter 19. It reminded me forcibly of episode 11, The Perils of Pamela. How often had I not sat in the sixpenny seats, eating a twopenny bar of milk chocolate, and yearning for similar things to happen to me. Well, they had happened with a vengeance. And somehow it was not nearly so amusing as I had imagined. It's all very well on the screen, you have the comfortable knowledge that there's bound to be an episode 1v. But in real life there was absolutely no guarantee that Anna the Adventuress might not terminate abruptly at the end of any episode. Yes, I was in a tight place. All the things that Rayburn had said that morning came back to me with unpleasant distinctness. "Tell the truth," he had said. Well, I could always do that, but was it going to help me? To begin with, would my story be believed? Would they consider it likely or possible that I had started off on this mad escapade simply on the strength of a scrap of paper smelling of mothballs? It sounded to me a wildly incredible tale. In that moment of cold sanity I cursed myself for a melodramatic idiot, and yearned for the peaceful boredom of Little Hampsley. All this passed through my mind in less time than it takes to tell. My first instinctive movement was to step backwards and feel for the handle of the door. My captor merely grinned. "Here you are and here you stay," he remarked facetiously. I did my best to put a bold face upon the matter. Was invited to come here by the curator of the Cape Town Museum. If I have made a mistake, a mistake? Oh, yes, a big mistake.